All right, well, thank you. It's great to be here. Yeah, the original title of this talk was Gardening Through the Deer Apocalypse. Which is the populations of deer are really high. I like to draw these silly little cartoons, and this is sort of people think, I'm going to garden and commune with nature, and then you start learning how obnoxious and difficult it can be to deal with deer in your garden. So talk today, I'm going to go through a little bit about why deer populations are so high, some of the issues that we're dealing with, and then give you the concrete things you can do to protect your plants at home to garden successfully in the face of deer overpopulation. So the why we're in such a bad problem with deer populations is pretty simple. We don't have any wolves anymore. We killed off basically all the wolves. They're the primary predator of white-tailed deer. Normally they would stay in an equilibrium of predator populations, prey populations without wolves. The deer populations have skyrocketed to higher than they've ever been that we can guess on the continent. And the impact of removing that keystone predator from the ecosystem can have lots of effects beyond just what we see in our home gardens. So where we have reintroduced wolves in North America, we've seen and they've documented the impacts that having those predators have on the ecosystem. So Yellowstone National Park reintroduced wolves, and they've studied through the Yellowstone Wolf Project how that has changed that ecosystem, reintroducing wolves there to control the elk populations there. And the impacts are beyond just reducing the elk populations, which they do, but they also change how those elk behave. And they've seen that have these whole trickle-down effects throughout the whole ecosystem. So without wolves, the elk formed big herds. They congregated around the rivers in big open areas, and they browsed intensively, eating everything down to the ground, killing off the willows and a lot of the other trees that were controlling erosion. And when the wolves came back, the elk populations dropped, but they also stayed on the move. They were scared now, so they were not staying in one place. So they would browse a little bit and then move, and browse a little bit and then move. So instead of killing plants, they were just trimming them a little bit. That allowed poplars and willows and a lot of other trees to establish, so they saw the whole tree populations change. That reduced erosion, and they saw this explosion then of populations of beavers that feed on those trees, birds that live in the trees. The whole landscape changed by having those wolves in there. So we're seeing some of the same impacts here when we've removed wolves from the ecosystem. We have this deer overpopulation, and those impacts go beyond just the frustrating things in our gardens. So this is okay, well, look at these screens. This is a picture of where I grew up in Northeast Ohio, in a park called Hell Hollow Park. So I grew up right outside this park, hiked it since I was 8 years old, knew it really, really well. And I have seen a huge change in that park just in the time that I've been observing it in my own lifetime. So what's happening with deer overpopulation is they're browsing tree seedlings. Of course, the canopy they can't affect, but they're impacting which types of trees can germinate and grow and potentially change the whole structure of our forests. So this forest is dominated by oaks, beeches, and hemlocks currently, and the seedling canopy is quite different. I have never seen, when I was 8 years old, I rarely saw a pawpaw in those woods. I'm now seeing pawpaws everywhere. Pawpaws have that strong scent to the leaves. Deer do not like eating them, and they are spreading as this understory layer, which we love pawpaws, but it's a huge change in the structure of this forest. We're seeing lots of pawpaw seedlings where I never saw them before. And the other thing we're seeing lots of in our forests is tulip poplars. That's another tree that deer do not browse because they have that strong scent to the new growth. So when the big oaks and the maples finally blow down and there's a hole in the canopy, they're being replaced by tulip poplars instead of the oaks and the maples that were there before. So we're seeing sort of throughout the eastern United States, this is a very long-term problem where it's not immediate, but as our forests are aging, the whole canopy is changing because of the deer browsing these things. On ground level, there's also a very dramatic changes happening in a lot of the wildflowers. So this is a picture from right here in Ann Arbor, Mary Beth Doyle Park. If you may know it, it's a little park in town. There's like and it's just this sea of trillium. It's stunning right about now, or sometimes it was. And trillium are one of deer's favorite snacks, and we're seeing a big drop of native wildflowers like trilliums, a lot of the understory where deer populations are high. You're going to see big carpets of trillium like this are starting to disappear. So we're seeing these impacts in the structure of our forests, and of course then that plays onto the pollinators that depend. These early blooming spring wildflowers are a key food source for our native bumblebees. The queens come out of hibernation, they have to establish a new hive, and they need this pollen source to get their hive started for the rest of the year. So these impacts go beyond our gardens into the larger ecosystem. And it can be one of the reasons why it's really important for us to, if you can, to create havens from the deer in your own landscapes, because you can create a safe space for native wildflowers, native trees, native species that can't survive deer overpopulation. You can create that haven, create food nectar sources for native pollinators. So it's beyond, I love roses, I like to grow my pretty flowers, I like to grow my vegetables, but it also can really impact, we can be like a refuge for these species in the face of deer overpopulation. We're also seeing sort of big impacts on deer. So I'm sure you've heard of chronic wasting disease. So this is a prion disease, tame type of disease is mad cow disease, a misfolded protein that's spreading throughout deer and related species in North America. And this does seem to also be related to a lack of predation, because deer infected with this disease have a long, slow decline. They slowly get sicker and waste away. And while they're sick, they're shedding that protein, which then infects other deer. When they're in high populations, it's easy for that to spread. But also when there's no wolves culling and catching the weaker, sicker individuals, they're living much longer with the disease and then infecting many more deer with that. So we're seeing some of these diseases that normally wolves hunting would pick off those weak individuals right after they get sick and reduce the chances to spread that disease. So there's a lot of issues with with the deer overpopulation beyond just our home gardens. My personal relationship with deer in the garden started when I was a teenager, and my first gardening love was roses. I just loved them. I still like growing roses. And deer also love eating roses. If you've ever tried to grow them in deer high pressure, they are really obnoxious. And I remember I saved up my money and I bought my first rose bushes. I was so excited, and they had beautiful flower buds on them. And I came out one morning to see if they had bloomed, and they were all eaten off. The unopened flower buds are their favorite snack. So in addition to, of course, the big ecological problems, it can be very, very frustrating as a gardener to buy plants that you want to grow and then see them get eaten. And it can be expensive. You invested a lot in this beautiful landscape, and then when it's all destroyed, very, very frustrating, very expensive, and very annoying. So we have this deer overpopulation, and there are, what is the future for that? Before we get to our home remedies, what is the future of deer overpopulation? One thing we know is that shooting deer with guns doesn't really affect the effect of wolves on the ecosystem. So you can use hunting or deer calls to reduce that population, but it doesn't change deer behavior. We talked about with that Yellowstone example that when there's predators, the deer move more. They don't graze one spot down. They move from place to place. And hunting doesn't create that same sense of constant alertness for predators. And so they still browse plants to the ground rather than nibbling a little bit and moving on. Hunting also doesn't cull sick individuals in the same way. When a deer has chronic wasting disease, it's a little bit sick, it's slower, and those are the deer that the wolves catch first. Hunters tend to shoot the ones with the biggest antlers because they want the trophy, so they often are hunting the healthiest individuals rather than the sickest individuals, which are allowing those diseases to persist. And of course, many places, hunting is simply not a safe or something we can be doing. In suburban neighborhoods where deer pressures are really, really high, lots of reasons we don't want people shooting guns at deer in our neighborhoods where our kids are playing and all those kinds of things. We do see wolf populations growing, and often with concern. So the Upper Peninsula has a good, healthy wolf population, and we do see occasional migration to the Lower Peninsula of Michigan. There's a lot of pushback to that. People obviously have a lot of fear about having wolves in their neighborhoods. Wolves don't coexist with humans very well, and they certainly are not favorite of farmers who have livestock, and deer hunters really hate wolves, actually. They do not want things killing the deer. If you're a deer hunter, deer overpopulation is a wonderful thing because lots of deer to shoot. So, I don't know, it'd be interesting to see animals do adapt, and we've seen a lot of species adapting to live in suburban areas, and we may see wolves starting to move more into those areas over time. There's a lot of food here. the first wolf pack that figures out how to successfully hunt in a suburban neighborhood is going to be feasting on deer and rabbits all day. So I don't know. We may see in time, nature's pretty good. If there's a lot of food around, something's going to figure out how to eat it, and the wolves may do that with our deer overpopulation eventually. The other interesting thing that's affecting deer populations is coyote populations. So this is something, coyotes are not native to this part of the country. They were out in the West. When we killed off the wolves, coyotes have been steadily migrating east into that vacancy that wolves have left. And interestingly, western coyotes are much smaller than the coyotes that we have here. Because in fact, the coyotes that you may have seen running around are usually hybrids between coyotes and wolves, or hybrids between coyotes and dogs, actually. So they're bigger than typical western coyotes. They tend to hunt in packs more. True coyotes do not only hunt alone. And we're seeing our eastern coyotes are really somewhere between a coyote and a wolf. And they're really good at living in our neighborhoods. They're really good at coexisting. I live in South Bend, Indiana. I can walk to downtown. You know, it's a very urban neighborhood, and I see a coyote run down my street pretty much every morning, which I'm very glad, because the rabbit population plummeted the second that coyotes showed up. So it'll be interesting to see if coyotes successfully, they don't take down adult deer, but they will take fawns, and they do seem to have some reduction on the deer population. But it may be that they will continue to get bigger, that they'll continue to hunt more in packs and sort of move into that opening that the wolves have left. So deer overpopulation probably is not going to be with us forever. At some point, something's going to figure out how to eat all these deer. But of course, there's a lot of people who don't like coyotes. So it's an article from a while ago from Michigan Public Radio that there's a lot of people who want to hunt coyotes here. Deer hunters don't like coyotes because they eat the deer. If you keep chickens, don't want coyotes. If you have cats that you let outside, the coyotes will take house cats and kill them too. So a lot of people don't like the coyotes. But I think the more we can accept those predators into our communities, we'll have a better chance of getting natural control of this deer population that'll get us out of this insane overpopulation and all its problems that we're facing right now. But the reality we live in right now is there's lots and lots of deer. They're eating your plants. I, as an individual, cannot reintroduce deer to the Midwest as much as wolves to the Midwest, much as I would love to. So what can we actually do in the space you control, in the garden where you're growing plants, to protect your plants? There's a lot of great reasons to do that. I talked about protecting native plants and creating refuges for native plants that are being impacted by deer overpopulation, not wasting money by buying plants and having them killed by deer, and generally reducing your levels of stress and worry in the garden, fussing with deer all the time. So if you're thinking about controlling deer in your garden, you want to start about thinking about how deer behave, how they're interacting with the world. The more you understand how a deer thinks, the easier you can be to effectively control them. One of the key things about deer and a lot of herbivores, prey species, is they're creatures of habit. So deer like to move in the same pattern every day, because if they're in the same routine, anything different can be flagged as possible danger. So I don't know if you can clearly see in this image, but there's a little path through the grass there. If you're in a woodland area, you'll see little narrow paths, which are deer paths, and they move on them often the same time every day. If you're watching in your garden, you may see them arriving at the same time every day along the same path. Deer form patterns and routines, and you can learn when they're coming places and where they're coming from to help control them. Going along with that, new is scary. If you're a prey species, something different in the environment is something dangerous in the environment. So we often will see there's a lot of sort of, I call them like Facebook meme controls for deer, of things you can do that will scare them. Often doing something new in your garden may scare the deer away for a little bit, just because it's different, because it's not the norm, it's outside their usual routine. However, once they get used to that, they're not going to be scared anymore. So there's a lot of short-term solutions of making your yard feel scary to deer that'll work for a few months, and then when the scent of that wolf urine you poured in your yard, or the dog hair you put in your yard, or whatever, that gets familiar, the deer will be used to it and it'll stop working. So sometimes these short-term fixes are not long-term fixes. Along with that, suburban deer are really different than rural deer. So I grew up in the middle of nowhere in Ohio. We had 12 acres. There was a 200-acre county park behind us. And when I started gardening, I knew that if I was gardening within a couple hundred feet of the house, the deer wouldn't come because they avoided humans. And if I went too far away, suddenly there was lots of deer. That is not true at all if you garden in a suburban neighborhood, if you have lots of neighbors. So there's a lot of old gardening advice about controlling deer and scaring deer away that worked when populations were lower or work if you live in a rural area. If they have other places to go, they're easy to scare out of your yard. If you're gardening in a suburban neighborhood, that's where it's the worst. There's people everywhere, there's dogs everywhere, there's all kinds of things that would normally be very scary to deer, and they've gotten used to all of that. So some of these sort of meme Facebook solutions of do this and that, and they'll scare your deer away with a common household item or whatever, may work in a rural area, but is not going to work in a suburban setting because those deer are completely inured to the smell of dogs, which are always on leashes, and the smell of people who do not hunt, and all those things. They're completely used to that, and they're going to be much, much harder to scare away from your garden. Other thing to understand when you're thinking about deer is that their behavior changes with the seasons. Depending on the time of year, their behavior is going to change. You're going to see changes in the deer interacting with your garden during the year. So in spring, deer are giving birth to new fawns. So the mothers have new mouths to feed, they need new food sources, and when they have new babies, last year's fawns tend to move off to new territories. The males will usually leave after 1 year, the females may hang on for a second year, but in spring, there's new babies, and the older deer are moving off into new territories. So spring is often when you're gonna see, I never had deer in my yard before. In the spring is when they're going to start exploring off of those old routines, off those trails that they've used every day, and go somewhere new. So it can be a really key time to control deer, to put up something to scare them away, because that's the chance when the deer are moving in somewhere new. They're looking for new food sources because there's new deer out there. Summer is usually the lowest time for feeding pressure. They've established new territories, new places to feed, they've established new routines, and there's lots and lots of food. So usually this is sort of the easiest time when you're going to get lulled into a false sense of security. Oh, I did something in the spring, it's good now, it's summer, there's lots of food sources, and it's easier to keep deer out of your yard. The exception to this is during droughts if you are irrigating in your garden. So if it's been a drought year and there's lots of dry and you're watering, you're making a little oasis of food in a desert, almost literal desert. So if you do have a drought year, that's when you're going to see deer really coming into your garden if you're irrigating. But if we have a regular rainy summer, lots of food, it's going to be the easiest time to keep deer away. Fall is another time that there's disruptions in their usual habits. It's breeding season, the males are going out to find females, and so they're moving around into new territories. And deer in these areas, our area, have learned to react to the start of hunting season. You will see dramatic changes in where the deer are on the beginning of hunting season. They have learned what a gun means. They know what's happening when that suddenly people come up and start hunting. So my parents live in rural Virginia, and they had all these deer in their backyard. My uncle is a hunter, and they said, okay, well, come and start of hunting season and hunt some of these deer. And they said they're there every single morning. First day of hunting season, they did not see a single deer until the end of that. They move to safe spaces. Often, if you're in a suburban neighborhood, that's the safe space. So they're off in a park. If there's an area kind of near you where hunting is allowed, the deer may be in those areas in the summer, and when hunting season, boom, they're going to show up. They're going to move into suburban neighborhoods. They're going to move to spaces where there are not hunters. Some of that is learned patterns over time, and some of that is just running away from the sound of guns, which is scary. So you may see, again, a big change in the deer in the fall season. It's certainly at the beginning of hunting season. Often behavior changes really dramatically. And then winter is the other time that deer behavior can change really dramatically because there's very little food, and they shift what they're eating. So in the summer, they're eating mostly tender new growth. They eat a lot of perennials. In the winter, they're going to shift from that to eating stuff that's evergreen. So if you grow conifers, you're usually not going to get any damage any time of the year except for the winter. Deer don't prefer to eat spruces and pines and hemlocks, but that's their main food source in the winter. This is a picture of Hidden Lake Gardens down in Tipton, which is a gorgeous place if you've ever been there. They have this incredible conifer collection. It's really, really beautiful. If you go there right now, the conifers are unfenced. They're beautiful. They're gorgeous. In the fall, they put an electric fence around that conifer garden just for the winter months to keep the deer out, to keep the damage. And that works because the deer do not want to eat conifers in the summer. But in the winter, anything that's evergreen, anything that's green over the winter is going to become a prime target for deer browsing in the winter. And that really is going to depend on what you're growing. If you're a vegetable gardener, or if you love to grow hostas and daylilies and perennials that go dormant in the winter, you can probably forget about deer in the winter. If you love to grow conifers, if you have an evergreen hedge, anything that's evergreen is going to be a big target for deer browsing during the winter months. They'll eat the needles. So tip off, usually it's the newest growth, the most tender newest growth that they're eating. So we've understood some of the problem, talked a little bit about some of the behavior of deer and how you can understand their habits changing seasonally. What do you do about it? So I mentioned what I call Facebook meme solutions, which are really not going to work. There's a lot of them that go around. Hang Irish Spring, a strongly scented soap up. I've seen people say, get hair clippings from the barber shop, put out used cat litter, all these kinds of things. These are things that probably used to work when deer populations were lower and may work if you live in a very rural area where there's lots of other spaces for deer to go. If you're in a suburban neighborhood, these solutions are going to do absolutely nothing. Deer in suburban neighborhoods are totally used to smelling humans, to smelling dogs, to smelling perfumes and all these weird things, and they're completely used to them. So that's a whole class of solutions that really are not effective. And they probably used to be. When deer populations were low, it was probably easier to do that. But deer today have gotten very, very used to humans. I know when I was hiking recently in an urban park, and there was a mother deer with her fawn actively nursing about 10 feet from me while I had my dog on a leash. And they just stood there and looked at me. They're like, oh, I see a hunting dog. I know it's on a leash. This is totally fine. They are not easy to scare. So some of these solutions that used to work just don't work anymore. Dogs can be an effective, so this is my old dog Bodie, who's an American foxhound, love to chase things. Dogs can be an effective deterrent if they have access to the space where the deer are coming in. So this is my old garden in Virginia. It was fenced in. Bodie was out running there all the time, and they kept the deer out of the garden. I hesitate to recommend you shouldn't get a dog just to scare away deer. I don't think that's a great reason to have a dog. But if you do have a dog and you're hoping it's going to scare deer away, it needs to be able to run loose. If it is not out there chasing the deer are going to learn that. And even in many areas, if your dog is always inside at night, which it probably has to be, the deer will just come at night when the dogs are not out. So this is interesting. Deer in rural areas are active during the day. Deer in suburban areas shift to be nocturnal. So that's one of their adaptations to living with humans is they're mostly active at night. And so I've seen people recommend dogs as deer deterrent. If you are somewhere where you can let your dog out of a dog door into a fenced area and it can run out at midnight and bark at those deer and scare them away, that will work. Most of us don't want our dogs running out at midnight and barking at deer. Certainly our neighbors don't want that. So as a solution, it's really not that effective unless you can really let that dog have access to the space. And if your dog is fenced into this area and your garden is fenced over here, not going to work at all. Individual plant fencing can work. So this is a friend of mine's garden up in northern Michigan where he has these new trees and he's put wire fencing around that tree. This can be a short-term solution, especially for trees that are going to outgrow the browsing range of deer. So deer are really only going to eat up to 5 or 6 feet high on a plant. So if you have a tree that's going to be a big shade tree, you can put that temporary barrier around it to protect it while it grows out. I've seen this used for perennials, for shorter plants as well, and it's really not a long-term solution just because it's ugly. Most of us are planting a garden to be beautiful, and if your whole garden is a big bunch of wire cones, it's a pain to weed around. The plants don't look good. They're going to grow through it and start getting browsed. So I would only recommend caging individual trees if it's a shade tree that's going to be able to get tall enough to grow out of that browsing range, and it's a temporary solution to protect that plant while it's growing. Here's a visual that you're going to see a lot of where browsing range is. Arborvitaes, again, not during the summer. This is a prime food for deer during the winter months, and that's the line that deer will browse to, somewhere around 5 or 6 feet high. If you drive around, you're going to see it everywhere on arborvitaes that they're browsed up to that point, and then it stops. That's where they'll stop reaching. So that's the point you have to put your wire cage up to, and the point that your tree needs to grow beyond for this to be useful. And certainly for conifers that you want to branch to the ground, this is not you could put a cage around this, but it's always going to look ugly and weird. At some point you need to either just prune off those lower branches or something, because this is going to look a little strange as the deer are browsing the bottoms of those arborvitaes. So repellents are a solution that a lot of people try and can be a short-term solution. Repellent sprays are going to work, but you got to use them right, and you cannot really rely on them for a long-term protection. So I'll give you a few. The explanation really is, and there's a bunch of repellent sprays. We'll talk more about the different ingredients they use. Repellent sprays do not make the food poisonous to the deer. It just makes it taste bad or smell weird. And deer will learn over time that even though it smells bad, they can eat it. And if you are not spraying regularly, you're going to effectively train the deer to get used to. So if you spray it with that repellent spray, it smells terrible, the deer aren't going to eat it. Over time, that wears away until it gets less and less smelly. And if the deer smells a little bit off and then they taste it and it tastes good, then they're going to learn, oh, it smelled weird, but it was fine. So if you spray it and then forget about it for 6 months and then spray it again, you're effectively training the deer to learn to ignore that repellent spray. So if you're spraying repellents, you need to be religious about applying it weekly. You need to apply it after a heavy rain. In the spring, you need to do it every time really regularly, because all the new growth will not be treated. So right now the plants are growing really fast. You spray this week, next week it's grown 6 new leaves. Those new leaves are not treated. The deer will come up, they'll smell a little bit of that repellent spray, but they'll taste the new growth, it's fine, and that starts training them that don't worry about it. It smells bad, but it's actually okay. My personal experience and the experience of a lot of people is you can kind of get 2 to 3 years out of a repellent spray before the deer will be trained to ignore it. That may be more or less depending on your deer pressures, if other people in your neighborhood are using the same repellent sprays. If somebody else has been using it for a long time, your local deer may just ignore that repellent spray. And the more religious you are about spraying regularly and carefully, getting the whole plant treated, the longer you're going to be able to get that to work. Other thing you can do to make repellents work longer is to rotate modes of action. So there's 3 different ingredients that are in repellent sprays. These brands, there's a bunch of different brands. The brands are all the same, but it really comes down to the ingredients. So liquid fence is really common. Liquid fence has putrefied egg solids, rotten eggs. It smells terrible. Plant skid is another popular one, which is dried blood. So it's disgusting. They're all disgusting. Dried blood, that smells bad to the deer. And then Deer Pro and several other ones have capsaicin, which is the hot chemical in hot peppers. So these are 3 different ways. Those are the main 3 chemicals. I'm not recommending these brands. There's a bunch of brands. They're all going to have one of these 3 chemicals. I mean, they're naturally occurring chemicals, but there's compounds that smell bad or taste bad or are spicy, hot to the deer. If you're using repellent sprays, their best option is to rotate through a different mode of action each time you treat. Because if you're always using a liquid fence with the rotten egg smell, over time they're going to get used to that. But if they come up one day and it smells like rotten eggs, and then a few weeks later it smells like dried blood, and a few weeks later they try it and it's spicy hot, it keeps them from learning to ignore one of those modes of action. So if you are using repellent sprays, I would say get one of each. Or get one, when you run out of that one, buy a different one with a different mode of action and rotate through all 3 of them over time. That'll give you the best control over the long term and keep the deer from just learning to ignore the sprays that you're using. But I would say repellent sprays are really going to be, if you have high deer pressure, especially in a suburban area, they're a temporary solution. This is your solution until you can get a fence built. This is your solution for a tree that's going to outgrow browsing. There's not a solution with repellent sprays that 10 years from now you're going to be, I still love it, it's still working great. It also can get really expensive, actually. You buying one bottle, you think, oh, that's not that much. If you're buying this bottle, you need to spray the whole plant once a week during the growing season and buy a new one. It rapidly adds up to a lot more. So I think a lot of time we think a deer fence is such an investment. If you do a few years of repellent sprays, it's going to be more expensive than your fence, and then they're going to stop working. So this is a stopgap measure, not a permanent solution. In that same class is a product I've seen around, and there's a few different companies making similar things called wireless deer fence. So these little stakes, you put batteries in the bottom, you put a little scent pellet at the top that actually smells tasty to deer, and there's 2 wires that come up. They smell it, oh, that smells good. They go to eat it, and it gives them electric shock. And then they're scared, oh my goodness, this garden is dangerous. It smells like this, but it's scary, and they run away. I would say, like repellent sprays, it's effective for a few years and the deer will start getting used to it. So it trains them to avoid the smells, but it's a good short-term solution. And certainly, if you use it in combination with repellent sprays, you can pretty robust short-term solution. I have used it, and I've had, again, effect for a couple years, and then they start learning to ignore the stakes, to just go around the stakes to eat the other things. They're also kind of a pain. You have to change the batteries or they'll stop working. You have to change the little scent. There's a little, there's a little bait that goes in there that lures them in, and you have to change that regularly. And gardening around it, you're going to get electrocuted. It's not that miserable, but it's painful. Certainly, if you're gardening with kids, not a great idea, but they are designed to be camouflaged. They're green so the deer don't notice them, and they get electrocuted. They're about at ankle height. They're not fun to have in your garden. So a short-term solution, but not a long-term one, and not a great solution in my personal experience. So this all comes down to your only real solution is a fence. A strong, tall fence is your real solution for controlling deer. And that's, I wish there was a magic bullet. We all wish there was like, oh, this easy trick that'll keep them out of your yard. And really the fencing is the only solution I've ever seen or heard of that you can install today, and 10 years from now, you're still gonna be happy and not have deer in your garden. So, fences for deer, there's a few things to keep in mind. They need to be 8 feet tall to keep deer from jumping over. If they're opaque, they can be shorter, so deer will not jump over a fence if they can't see what's on the other side. So a 6-foot-tall opaque fence, like a wooden privacy fence, will be enough to keep most deer out. Even though they can jump over it, they can't see if they're going to fall and break their leg on the other side. So they'll usually not jump over a 6-foot fence that's opaque. If it's an open wire mesh, it needs to be at least 8 feet tall. You can also, deer are not great at jumping horizontally long distance. They can jump extremely high, but they can't jump extremely far over. So 2 4-foot fences set 4 feet apart, 3 to 4 feet will work, will also keep them out because they can't clear both of them at once, and there's not enough room for them to jump and do both of them and get a running start to get over the second one. So any of those solutions can work, and depending on your situation and what you're doing, there may be a different version that's going to work for you. But those are kind of the 3 main fence heights that are effective. Electric fences can work as well, but I don't love them almost for all the same reasons as those little wireless electric fences. They're really unpleasant to have around in your garden. Not great if you have kids, if you have visitors. I live in a neighborhood with a lot of kids walking to school. Electric fence in the front yard is not just not a good idea. Also, electric fences really do rely on deer learning to avoid them because they're afraid of them. So unless it's 8 foot tall, they can jump over an electric fence. And usually you put up an electric fence, you bait it with peanut butter so they come, sniff it, get electrocuted, and learn to be afraid of it. But that's relying on them never trying to jump over it. They're expensive, they're a lot of maintenance, you need to have electricity flowing to it. So I really don't recommend electric fences for most home gardeners because it's a lot of maintenance and it's just not practical. Time that is effective, again, Hidden Lake Gardens uses it as a seasonal installation for the winter. And they can simply hook up small stakes, electric fences just to protect conifers for the winter that they can take down in the spring when people are coming to visit the gardens. That's about the only time I really think electric fence works, but if you have a home garden that you want to protect year round, a regular fence is going to be a lot better than your electric one. Something people often don't think about is when you're installing a new fence, it's really good to combine that with repellent sprays when it's new. So deer can, if they really, really try, they can clear an 8-foot fence. Sometimes they can get sometimes up to a 10-foot fence. Those things can be hard, but if you don't make it anything nice for them to jump over the fence to get, they're way less likely to try to figure out how to breach that fence. So several research studies have found the most effective way is when you build a new fence, spray one of those repellent sprays, any of those modes of action, the plant skid or liquid fence, so that the deer on their old routine, coming down their deer path, coming to get lunch, both have a new fence to try to jump over, and it smells terrible on the other side. And that sort of suspenders and belt solution trains them to avoid that fence and never even give it a try. So here's just pictures of some of the fencing solutions. So like I said, an opaque fence, a privacy fence like this at 6 feet will usually work quite effectively. This is an old garden of mine on the other side where I have, this is a plastic mesh fence that was 8 feet tall. That was really effective, but because the deer can see through it, they will jump it if it's only 6 feet. But if it can't see through it, they will not jump over a 6-foot fence. So if you can see through it, go to 8 feet at least to give protection. This is just an example to show that my little plastic fence was indeed working. Cucumbers on the one side of the fence, they're just fine. The vines that made it through are all getting nibbled off by the deer and the rabbits. So these fences will work and give you protection, but you really need to install them thoroughly and carefully and get them at the height enough to go with where the deer can see through them. This is a picture of my garden in Virginia. When I first moved in, I had this low 4-foot chain link fence that did actually keep the deer out because we also had a dog. And the dog was running in that fence regularly. He could go out and patrol that space. And the people who lived there before me had also had a dog. There had been a dog there for decades, and the deer had learned over years to avoid this yard as somewhere they're going to get chased by a dog. So lower fences may work, but this is a fence that I'm sure if you didn't have a dog there, if the people who bought that house after me didn't have a dog, they're going to quickly learn to jump over this, and they may eventually learn to jump over this fence at night when the dog's in the house or something like that. Yeah, so there's Bodie protecting my garden. The other really key thing I would say with deer and dealing with deer is you want to act before you have a problem. So we talked about how deer are creatures of habit. They're creatures of routine. That once they establish that your yard is a great food source, they will remember that. They will come back seasonally. The mothers teach the fawns where good food sources are. So if you have a new garden, if you're just starting a garden, or you don't even have a lot of deer pressure yet, that's the time to, I would always say, put up your fence first and plant your garden second. Because if you plant all this delicious food, you're training deer to come into it. And often we plant something, and then when deer eat it, we spray it, and then when they eat it more, we build a fence, and we sort of have this back and forth. If you go out in the beginning and fence off your yard, which has nothing good to eat in it, then the deer are not going to try to jump that fence, and they're going to easily learn to avoid your yard. Reinforcing new fence, again, try to do everything all at once. Instead of doing a piecemeal, oh, I did a repellent, that didn't work, then I did a fence, then I did that. Do everything at once to really scare the deer off, to say this is a bad place to go. It's hard to get in. There's repellent sprays. There's a dog running around. Everything is bad about this yard, and teach them to come out of it. You also may want to reapply the repellent sprays periodically in a fenced yard, especially if your fence is only 6 feet tall, during the spring and winter. Winter when they're seeking out new food sources because food is scarce, and spring when they're looking for new habitats because you have new babies. So if you have a 6-foot fence that's hard for them to jump over but not impossible, I would say having a periodic habit of just spraying a repellent spray during spring and winter will help keep them from ever trying to get into your yard. The other thing you should be aware of is where the deer in your community are hanging out now. I've heard this many times from gardeners. I never had deer because there was this big forest over here. Then that was cleared and a new housing development in, and suddenly all the deer came into my yard. So if where you garden, think about where the established woodlands are around you. If that's a protected park that's going to be protected forever, that's great. But if it's private property that's going to be developed, if you know that a forest is about to get cut down, the deer are going to migrate from that into your yard. You're going to see a huge influx of deer. So certainly act. If you can act before the deer get there, you're going to be way ahead of the game rather than trying to play catch up afterwards when they've already learned that you have the most delicious garden buffet in the neighborhood. Okay, this is where the end where I'm not going to give you what you want, which is I know everybody wants a list of plants that deer don't eat. And my experience is that if they're hungry enough, they will eat just about everything. So these are, I love gladiolus. So this is a garden. Actually, when I lived here in Michigan, I grew gladiolus in an open field, no fence, no repellents. The gladiolus had a lot of deer damage on my other plants. They never touched my gladiolus. They were just fine. I moved to Virginia. I planted the same gladiolus, and they ate off every single flower stem. And I have other friends who they will go and eat them right down to the ground. So different deer in different areas have different tastes. When the deer population is very high like it is and food is scarce, they will start eating things that they do not normally eat. And it can be very hard to find a really deer-proof list of plants that's going to be, every time I say, oh, hellebores are famously a deer-resistant perennial. And then I was giving a talk one time and said, hellebores, and by the way, they're deer-resistant. And someone said, not in my yard. So there's certainly, I would think if you're thinking about, if you have a space that you cannot fence off, that you cannot exclude deer from, and you're thinking about what's going to plant there, think about deer resistance as a sliding scale of preference. There's plants that they like more. Hostas, roses, daylilies, always going to be their favorites. And there's plants that they like less. Hellebores, daphnes, a lot of these other plants. But there's very few plants that no deer will ever eat. And if you do have a garden space that you cannot fence off, my advice would be you can find, there's a million lists of deer-resistant plants. Try to choose things that are on those resistant lists. And then you're going to have to respond in real time to what your deer are actually eating. So if it's on, my advice would be, oh, I've heard this is resistance. Buy one, plant it, observe. And if it's not being browsed, then get more. And if it is being browsed, take it out and replace it with something else. But unfortunately, deer are unpredictable, and as populations are higher, they keep eating things that they've never eaten before and we don't think of as good classic deer food. So that's what I want to share with you today. Self-promotion, here's my books. If you want to get them, I'd love for you to check them out. And then if you have questions, contact me. My website is josephgardens.com, and I do a little print newsletter I send out if you're interested that I could send out to you. But I'd love to answer any questions if anybody has any.
I will come around with the mic so that we can hear it. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
So with deer fences being so tall, I'm worried about like reptiles and amphibians and small things that can't hop super high or climb. How are they going to be able to move through these spaces?
Yeah, so with deer fencing, usually you don't have to worry about reptiles, amphibians moving through because deer fences does not have to be it can be very large openings. And in fact, you'll be amazed at what will move through even a chicken wire size opening. A lot of things will move through those fences just fine. One concern you will find, so often when people put up a deer fence, they put it with a larger mesh to the 8 foot, and they often put a smaller mesh at the bottom to keep out rabbits, so they might do a chicken wire thing. What you will find is that the reptiles and amphibians move through just great, and the small mammals, the voles, etc., move through just great, but the foxes don't. And so you may see, if you do a fine mesh at the bottom that will excludes rabbits, you may see a big jump in mice and voles in your garden eating things. So my advice would be to use a larger wire opening because deer cannot get through, doesn't need to be chicken wire size. Use a larger opening and make that, and you can even leave the bottom foot open to allow other wildlife to move through, so you can keep predators, the smaller predators moving, and snakes and everything moving in and out of your garden just fine, and keep the deer out of that space.
Thank you. I always worry about my little guys.
Yeah, the little guys are amazing. The other thing I would caution with the biggest danger for the little guys is the bird netting that you put over berry plants to keep birds from eating strawberries. That snakes will get very, very tangled up in. And I had a nightmare where it came out and I had to like cut the snake out of bird netting. So bird netting, I would say, be very careful with. But the wire mesh fencing is not. Reptiles and amphibians move through that just fine. Yes.
Hi, thank you. We started a raised garden bed and we had a nightmare with deer all last 3 years. I read on newspaper that like somewhere in websites, there are marigold and catmint, I think is the name of a plant. Those could be effective in deterring. We got some seeds, we haven't grown them yet. We are planning to grow this year. Wanted to get your opinion on those.
Yes, so you'll often see recommendations to plant marigolds or onions or garlic, plants that they don't eat, around plants that they do want to eat. That ain't gonna work, unfortunately. So deer are browsers. They, in the woods, are always looking through lots of different plants to find that the ones they don't eat, and they will very happily have your beautiful plants surrounded by marigolds, and they'll go right between those plants that they don't like and eat the ones they do in the middle. So yeah, those plants, it's a little like those plants that are, they repel mosquitoes. Like, well, they repel mosquitoes if you rub them on your skin. They don't just keep them out of your garden, and the deer will move right past those plants. Those are great plants to grow because the deer won't eat them, but if you want to grow your vegetables, got to put a fence around them.
Anyone else? Okay. Thank you so much,
All right,
Joseph.
thank you.